It's the week ending Saturday the 26th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Wagner's boss Yevgeny Prigozhin reported to have been killed in a plane crash in Russia. The nurse Lucy Letby jailed for life for murdering 7 babies under her care, and GCSE pass rates in England, Wales and Northern Ireland falling for a second year running. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arian McNichol. Let's unwrap the week. And it's that time of year again when Olly goes off on holidays, so I'll be stepping in for the next couple of weeks, and joining me today from the Week's digital team, it's Harriet Marsden and Julia O'Driscoll. Plus, fresh back from her trip to Australia for the Women's World Cup, it's BBC sports journalist Emma Smith. Emma, how was it out there?
It was fantastic, thank you. And it's great to hear your voice because it reminds me of being back out there. It's giving me nostalgia already.
I've got a bit local. My Aussie accent has turned into one of those waxent kind of hybrids, I reckon.
One thing that I learned, which was apparently in order to do a Australian accent, you have to basically act as if you're squinting at the sun. But I'm not going to do the accent because I'm terrible at accents.
Yeah, I reckon squinting at the sun and then speaking through your nose, mate. But Emma, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, national federations refused to be pawns in the global ban on trans chess players.
I think most people understand the arguments when it applies to sports that have athletic ability, speed or strength or size as important factors. In chess, the Chess Federation has not explained this terribly clearly. To most people, they think, what is the difference? What advantage is a biological male purported to have over a biological female? And the whole thing's a mess because this decision seems to have offended both advocates for the trans community and feminist advocates who think that it is patronising to women to make this decision.
White House columnist for The Hill, Niall Stanage, speaking to News Nation last week. Emma, what's happened this week?
So on Monday, a ban on transgender women competing in female events came to play in chess. Chess is the latest sport, and it is a sport according to the International Olympic Committee. It's the latest sport to enact a ban on trans women competing in female events. It's been enacted by the International Chess Federation, commonly known by its French acronym, which is FIDE, F-I-D-E. It's introduced drastic changes to eligibility and classification of trans players, including a ban of up to 2 years on trans women in women's events, pending a review of individual player statuses.
So this review that they're doing, I mean, what analysis or what do they actually need to work out? What is it that the International Chess Federation wants to determine over that 2-year period?
Well, that's a very good question. The reasonings and the methodology behind the ban, it's effectively a ban. Their reasons are rather opaque. They've said that genderism has significant impact on a player's status and future eligibility without really going into details. It's not entirely clear what their basis is and what sort of they're intending to find out through these reviews.
Well, regardless of what analysis they want to do, Julia, what ability do they actually have to enforce this ban? Can it just be disregarded at a national level?
So I am no chess expert, but my understanding is yes. So the English Chess Federation has said that it is going to refuse to uphold these new rules. And similar positions have been taken by federations in France, Germany, and the US. And there is currently a championship going on in France in which a trans woman has competed in a women's category. So it seems that it can be overruled depending on where the tournament is being taken place, but obviously it's at the discretion of the event organisers.
Yeah, and Harriet, this obviously isn't the first time we've seen trans women being banned from competing in female sporting events, as we were hearing from Niall Stanage at the top. Usually that's because of some concerns about, I don't know, athleticism rather than anything else. But chess just feels like a quite different sport, if it is a sport, as Emma says, to these other sports, doesn't it, Harriet?
No, absolutely. I mean, if your argument if your argument is that women's sports categories should exclude trans women because of some innate biological discrepancy, which is in itself is a highly contentious position. I mean, it has also been disregarded and refuted by multiple studies. But if that is your position, then this ban would seem to be incredibly logically inconsistent. But if your argument is that women's only events were created to make space for women in male dominated fields, then this ban is still logically inconsistent. Because, I mean, chess is an extremely male dominated field. I think about 15% of the FIDE registered players are only 15% are women. But that has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with sexism and sociology and investment and rape, misogyny, harassment. It's just, I mean, this is a Trojan horse for bigotry. This is an absolute red herring. And a lot of the female chess players are calling it a distraction. I mean, it was only last week that 14 French chess players published an open letter alleging sexual violence in the sport and a widespread culture of misogyny at tournaments, which they claim are making it impossible to actually compete and the reason why girls weren't competing. And a lot of women in chess have signed that. So with these sports federations move to ban trans women from competing in women's sports, and they claim that that's to do with fairness, they haven't taken any steps to address why we need women's sports categories in the first place. There are a million ways that competitive sport is the deck is stacked against women, and absolutely none of them will be meaningfully solved or improved by banning trans women from competing with them. And this ban, I don't believe that any trans women is a threat to women's sport as much as this ban is a threat to them.
Yeah, I mean, Emma, is anything being done to support transgender chess players, do you know?
Well, obviously you have the public statements of support from several leading figures in the sport. There's also been statements of support from externally as well. Angela Eagle, who the Labour MP, who was herself a UK chess champion at junior level in I think it was the 1976 English under-18 champion. She's spoken out against the ban and basically says that what it effectively represents is this belief that men would be intellectually superior to women, and so banning someone who's transitioned from male to female is sort of like an implication of that. And obviously you do have the signs of support which have come from the national federations. English Federation say that the ban is incompatible with English law in regard to release of personal data, so effectively you can't just out trans people as being trans, and as well as discriminatory. The French Federation said chess is inclusive is by nature inclusive and intergenerational, and that effectively banning someone on grounds of trans identity has no place in the sport. So there has been various statements of support. However, FIDE, International Chess Federation, have pressed ahead with the ban regardless.
Yeah, on that question of inclusivity, Julia, I saw a Guardian article where the question was posed to readers, why is it important to even maintain chess competitions that are separated into male and female categories? Some wag wrote back, in case they mate, haw haw. But I actually would like a serious answer to the question. I mean, why has chess been separated along gender lines historically?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was something when I was researching that I was struggling to find like solid answers for, but the general consensus seems to be tradition, that this was a game created by men for men in the medieval times, and so for a long time throughout history has just been the activity of men, and so there have been real efforts in the last 100 or so years to boost female participation in the game, but women are still very underrepresented. I think there's around 1,700 grandmasters in the world and only about 40 are women. And I was reading that there's obviously this kind of societal traditional aspect, but also that there's kind of an old boys club mentality around it and this kind of institutionalized, very male dominated structure. But then there was also, so women's only events do also give female players the opportunity to compete for prize money that they might otherwise have less of a shot at getting in open competitions. They also get more media coverage, which I thought was quite an interesting point. And obviously changing kind of just increasing awareness and attention on the sport itself. So it's a tricky one, but a long history to grapple with there.
I mean, it's not a sport that hasn't been getting media coverage lately, not least because of the other scandals that have been engulfing the game. Harriet, can chess survive all of this?
It's a really interesting question. I don't think that anyone, though, is arguing that there aren't reasons why we need separate women's categories. I think what we're saying is that there doesn't seem to be any justification in keeping trans women out of those categories. I mean, for example, this ban, it said that it would take away prizes won by trans men when they were competing as women. So this retroactive punitive aspect of it, I think that really is when they're showing their hand, and it's absolutely nothing to do with inclusivity, and it's nothing to do with fairness in women's categories, because if it were, then FIDE would go and take like actual tangible steps to improve the sport for all players, but including women. All the issues around the cheating scandals we've seen, now this allegation of sexual violence and harassment and rape, like if they actually cared about fairness in women's sports, these would be the issues they would address. And I think that it's important to actually listen to the people who would be affected by this ban, like the trans professional chess player who's a chess master, Yosha Iglesias, said this policy is going to lead to depression and suicide attempt in trans players, regardless of which side that they would be competing in. So can chess survive this? Yes, I think it will, and it can. And I just think that the question is whether or not women's chess will survive. And that question has nothing to do with whether trans women compete with them or not.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll have to all wait as the next moves unfold. Julia, you're up next after this. All right, Julia, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
An own goal by Nike.
Decision is penalty.
It took so long to make the decision, but the decision has been made. A penalty for Spain. Well, Mary Earps needed by England. Getting Hermoso for Spain. The biggest penalty of her career, her long career. It's Hermoso. And Earps swallows it up. That's why she's the best goalkeeper in the world. Mary Earps keeps England in the final.
It still gives me goosebumps, and part of why I love that footage is because of what Earps is evidently saying as she's reacting to that penalty save. That was ITV highlights from the England-Spain World Cup final on Sunday. That one didn't exactly fly under the radar, Julia, but what's the less well-reported aspect of the story?
So there's been a lot of news about the Lionesses this week, and while they didn't bring the World Cup home, Mary Earps did win the Golden Glove Award on Sunday. So that's the title of the best goalkeeper in the tournament. However, people who want to celebrate in her success by buying a replica shirt of her official kit are unable to, and that's the underreported story this week. So a decision was taken by Nike, who manufacture the official England kit at the start of the tournament, that they wouldn't be producing a replica of Mary Earps' shirt for fans to buy. And the goalkeeper said at the time that she found it incredibly disappointing and hurtful. And so this has kind of been simmering along throughout the tournament, but has really come to a peak, obviously, with Earps' incredible performance throughout, but especially in the final, and making that incredible save in the penalty as well. And a change.org petition this week has kind of gone viral online. It started with about 70,000 signatures on Sunday and has already doubled. And I'm sure by the time this goes out, it will be nearing its 200,000 signature mark.
I mean, I'm sure Nike, they wouldn't say this out loud, but I'm sure their reasoning would have been presumably purely commercial, that they assumed that there just wouldn't be a market for this. Why, now that there probably almost definitely is a market for this, would they not be changing course?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess one thing would be having to admit that they got it wrong. Also, Catherine Bate, who is the football writer at the Daily Mail, pointed out that manufacturers have argued that if they were to make this exception for England, or not exception, if they were to allow it for England, they would have to do it for all teams that they produce national kits for. And not everybody has a Mary Earps, who is the world's best female goalkeeper. So you can see why they might be reluctant to do so, but it's still not really standing up.
Harriet, there's obviously a pretty clear demand for them. Fans have started taking matters into their own hands on this one, haven't they?
Yeah, no, they have. But I think it's important to consider where Nike is actually getting its orders from. So I think that this is a really key point here. Nike are taking all this flack for what I think we can all agree is a massive, massive PR own goal. They admitted before the final that the demand for the entire squad, that the demand was huge. They do sell the goalkeeper tops for the England national men's side too. So any argument about, well, we'd have to do it they already do it for the England men's team. So I think that we can also call that baloney. But who orders Nike to produce the shirts? That is the FA. I mean, they are losing business to smaller retailers like you just mentioned that have moved into the space that's been left by Nike. There's a Oxford-based record label that has produced its own version of the kit. Similar smaller retailers are doing kind of gonzo, like guerrilla style Mary Earps shirts. Nike doesn't want to lose business, and it did say that there was a big commercial demand. The question is whether or not the FA actually ordered them to make the shirt in the first place. And that is where I think that that's a really, really, really important question to be answered. Let's not forget who the president of the FA is. That is Prince William, who was not at the final.
Well, before we go there, and we will definitely tackle that one, it is a slightly weird position to find ourselves in, demanding that a massive corporation make a product so that we can give them more of our own money. I mean, Emma, is all of this, is the old adage that all publicity is good publicity true in this case? Or, is this an exception to this rule?
I certainly think it does reflect poorly on sort of Nike's forward-looking strategy. They've said that they are working towards solutions for future tournaments when it comes to production of kit, which I think is code for we vastly underestimated the demand and we're going to, try and do a bit better in the future. But the thing is that, the signs were there. Earps plays for Manchester United, and her kit is the third most popular on sale for the women's team. She is a very popular player. And I just think that this idea that Nike have come up with, which is that if they produced a England goalkeeper kit, they would have had to produce a goalkeeper kit for all the other teams that they would have manufactured. I don't think that holds much water. You could produce every available kit in England, in the UK, where these players are from, and then that could possibly work like that. And it seems odd that such a huge multinational corporation has such a all or nothing approach to producing kit rather than something a bit more tailored. It should be worth saying that Nike are not the only guilty company here in terms of the kit manufacturers at the Women's World Cup. Adidas and Puma also did not produce goalkeeper kits from the 2023 World Cup. The only kit manufacturers who did were Hummel, who produced the Denmark kit, and Castore, who produced the Republic of Ireland kit. So if you're a fan of Denmark or the Republic of Ireland, you had the option, but not for the vast majority of the other 30 teams competing. I think it just seems like another example of which you could probably pull out as many as you like, of large organisations underestimating the popularity of women's football yet again, and sort of struggling to keep up with the huge boon in popularity that women's football has seen in the last 10 years, and certainly been supercharged in the last 2 or 3 years in the UK.
Yeah, Julia, is this demand, particularly for Earps's shirt, but I suppose England teams' shirts in general, is it because the women's game is becoming much more popular, or is it partly, particularly in Earps's case, because of the controversy? Are people after this shirt because it's become a cause célèbre and there's a bit of a kind of bandwagon jumping aspect to it?
I think that might be the case, and I can see how after the final, the petition having gained so many signatures, that is an argument that could be made. But I would say that seeing pictures of kids at home drawing Earps's name onto T-shirts, printing their own, kind of speaks for itself of the popularity of the game and also just the incredible standard of these players. Like, I was reading a very interesting piece about how women's goalkeeping has come on so much in recent history and just the level of data that is now available to teams to really tailor that, and how previously female goalkeepers would perhaps have gone through the same kind of training sets as other players. And now, obviously, that doesn't work. It's a completely different position, requires completely different skills. And so now that they're on a completely different nutrition plan, their training plan is tailored. There's just such a better understanding and investment in these players. And I mean, the football speaks for itself. And also, I think as well, there's been a few people saying how, the Euros was obviously a fantastic success. And then this year we've really seen the World Cup embraced in the way that men's football would be, and appealing to people across all demographics. So, yeah.
Well, two people who are exceptions to that rule are Prince William and Rishi Sunak. Harriet, we parked this question earlier, but said we might return to it. What do you make of William and Sunak not attending the final?
Well, I think Sunak is a different question entirely. And I don't think that we should be looking at it in the same place, because ultimately Rishi Sunak is a politician. He stands outside of football federations. He really, yes, it would have been great to see him there. He probably should maybe get on with actually running the government, but it's not the same thing as the actual president of the FA not being there. It just isn't the same. It could, and when Julia says that we've embraced the World Cup the way that the men's would have been embraced, that's demonstrably not the case in this regard. I mean, you can't argue that the president of the FA wouldn't have been at the men's World Cup final. And I also think that the question of underestimating demand is an interesting one. And I think it's not a justifiable one any longer, because ever since the Women's World Cup in 2019, every single year it's been record viewership, record match attendance, record interest, record coverage. These records are being broken every single tournament. And England won the Euros last year, the champions of Europe. So with that regard, when they're still making arguments about we've underestimated the demand for women's football and the interest in women's football, why? Why have you? The demand could not be more obvious. I mean, this final was one of the most watched British broadcasts of the year. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of people tuning in. So I don't think that the argument that they underestimate demand actually can stand up anymore. And I do think that when we're talking about Rishi Sunak and Prince William, it seems to me that they've blundered into an unbelievably stupid, really, really, really stupid situation they found themselves in. I mean, I don't know if you saw Rishi Sunak's tweet about the lionesses with a picture of the door with the lion knockers, which are, it's very obvious with lions and lionesses which one's which. It's one of the few animals where it's really, really, really obvious. Even a child could have told him that they weren't lionesses.
He also said they left nothing out on the field, which definitely isn't what he meant.
but they, both of them, they really made it worse. I mean, Prince William released a video with a sort of congratulatory video with his daughter, kind of the implication being, this is for girls. This is only for girls. The fact that I am a father of a daughter is why I care, even though I don't care because I'm not there. But here's my daughter. Look at my daughter.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Emma, you were out there. You saw so much of the World Cup unfold and you absorbed the atmosphere. Do you think that Nike in particular, and I suppose also by extension, Prince William not being there and Sunak not being there, are these the last gasps of the kind of shortchanging of the women's version of the sport of football that we're going to see, or is it just going to continue for some years yet?
I think, well, you hope that it's going to be this tournament will be a changing moment, and certainly in terms of the scale of the tournament, it would seem to be the case. Nearly 2 million fans attended matches in Australia and New Zealand, which is a new record for the Women's World Cup. You look at the viewership numbers for the final. I think it was 12 million on the BBC. So again, record numbers. You look at the football itself. The World Cup expanded to 32 countries for the first time. There were fears that it would be over-expansion, that there would be too many one-sided results, but outside of a couple of anomalies in the group stage, this was absolutely not the case. The quality of football was overall very high. You'd like to think that this would be the turning point, but I suppose the proof is only going to come around the next time there is a major tournament. I mean, and when the WSL season starts in the last weekend of September, first weekend of October, it depends on terms of whether that interest is maintained. I think it will be, but I suppose the proof can only be found when the games take place and when the games kick off again in about a month's time.
Okay, so producer Sophie has just told me that while we've been recording, Nike has announced that it will be releasing a limited number of goalkeeper jerseys for England, the US, France, and the Netherlands. So it looks like this story is going to go into extra time. Okay, Harriet, you're up next after this. Okay, Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The itch to twitch. Is Britain now a nation of birdwatchers?
Beautiful British birds are a much treasured addition to the nation's countryside. Not that they're exclusive to rural landscapes. Town and city dwellers are also treated to a close-up and personal view of these feathered delights that really are the most tangible link with wildlife enjoyed by the modern-day Brit.
British Country Birds, a visual field guide to birdwatching, a video from the YouTube channel Free Movies. Harriet, I must say that's exactly how I imagined a bird-watching voiceover might sound. What's the story this week?
So the story is that hundreds of people have turned up at this lighthouse off the coast of the Isles of Scilly just because they heard that this rare tropical bird had been sighted. This is the red-footed booby, which is it's native to the Galapagos Islands. But early this month, it was seen on Bishop's Rock Lighthouse. It's only the second time that it's been seen in the UK. So people travelled from all over the country just to get a glimpse of this bird. And some of them have been out 4 times. And it's reflective of a wider trend and a huge skyrocketing popularity of birdwatching since the pandemic.
So before we get to the trend, why was this particular booby so very far from home?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. The British Trust for Ornithology have suggested that it's to do with climate change. They said because the world's oceans have hit the highest temperatures ever recorded this summer, it could be pushing birds out of their usual habitats to look for more favorable conditions. So the last time this bird was spotted was 2016, which is not that long ago. But it could also be that, there's a growing interest, so people are seeing them more. They could have been there before anyway. But also we've got much better access to social media and online connections and apps that we can talk about later, which is really giving people more of an insight into where to look for them. So it could be a number of things.
It's an interesting thing that I hadn't considered, that actually the birds are being spotted more because there's more people spotting birds. Julia, what's leading to that? I mean, why is bird watching becoming more popular?
Well, as Harriet said, birdwatching became a lot more popular in the pandemic when we all slowed down and didn't have a whole lot to look at. So the RSPB saw an 85% jump in participation of their annual garden survey, which is where you record what birds you can see. So unsurprisingly, during the pandemic when that was all we could see. But it does seem to have really continued. And there's also been a few entrepreneurs jumping on this kind of community and shareability trend. So I was reading about an app called Birder, which has been developed. And it's kind of like a gamification of bird watching. So you can log on and either host like a whole bird watching session. I guess you like go for a walk and point out all your birds, or you can kind of post about them afterwards. And there's a leaderboard, but also you can just take part kind of, I mean, it sounds kind of like Strava or something like that for bird watching. And I think there's kind of, for all its negative points, social media is very good at bringing people together around very kind of niche communities and topics. And so I think this is a really nice example of that.
Yeah, I was sort of half wondering whether this is somehow to do with like the rise of Pokemon and then a generation who've grown up with that. I mean, Emma, is this a real life gotta catch 'em all?
Well, as someone from the generation that grew up with Pokemon, I certainly think that there is perhaps an element of that. I think it's both a combined element of that sort of the interest in sort of collecting, searching, sort of like the idea of having a hobby that leads to a certain goal and a sense of achievement, and also the generation that have grown up with social media. So bird watching is a hobby almost designed for social media, in that you can sort of take, you can go out, you can find these interesting sort of birds, these rare birds, take pictures of them, and then show off about them on your Instagram or on your Birder or Threads or whatever your social media of choice. Yeah, and I think that certainly has led to the demographic of bird watching changing. I suppose it's again sort of similar to in the way that certain hobbies that were once associated, with older, middle-aged men as a stereotype are now being sort of co-opted by younger people. You can throw, craft beer into that sort of. It's one of those hobbies which, when you first hear about it, seems a bit like an odd sort of new trend. But when you sort of think about the sort of the details and about why it would appeal to a younger generation, it starts to make a little bit more sense.
It's funny in a way that we're talking about the sort of social media aspect and the technology and the apps that are helping people get into it, which sort of almost feels contradictory, don't you think, Harriet, given that twitching or bird watching, as a lot of people prefer when they're not very serious about it, it's fundamentally about getting out into nature, isn't it? You shouldn't be looking at your phone. You should be looking at what's in front of you.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely, but we're not saying that people are just sat there looking at their phone instead of out there walking, looking and listening for the bird song and looking for that flash of wing or anything like that. They're not. I mean, you would go home and you might, or for example, you would see on the app, well, XYZ bird has been spotted in this place, so I will go now out into nature. So we're not saying that people are walking around with their face in their phone, but I mean, it is the perfect modern hobby. Like it's cheap, it's inclusive, anyone can do it anywhere. You don't need specialist equipment. It can be very peaceful. It's fantastic for mental health. It's really about connecting with nature and observing the changing patterns and the kind of it completely changes your relationship with time as well when you reconnect with nature and growth and plants and bird watching and migration and patterns. Instead of, I think that's probably why it became so popular in the pandemic, instead of seeing the passage of time as sort of an inexorable march towards death, you're seeing it as this kind of growth and life regeneration. But it's also not niche. It's not niche at all anymore. It's 3 million Brits are doing this. It's huge in Hollywood. It's absolutely massive. There's tons of celebrities are into it. So I think that we can say that it's really, there's something for everyone in it. Yes, there's the gamification and the social media aspect that might appeal to a younger generation, but the peacefulness, the gentle observation and the kind of the anti-instant gratification, the demands for patience and luck and just taking it as it comes. I mean, that appeals to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I gather this particular bird was in the Scilly Isles is that there's some suspicion that it could be part of a broader climate change story. I mean, Julia, do you think that the rise in bird watching could somehow also help, I don't know, like flag up when species are appearing or disappearing from certain parts of the natural world?
Yeah, definitely. And I think all those points Harriet was raising about like connecting with nature all play into that. I was looking into some statistics, and the UK has apparently lost 40 million birds since 1970, and in the US it's 3 billion birds in the same period. And so we don't quite know yet the environmental implications of what that might look like, but I think any kind of increased engagement and attention on the issue is really great news. I heard a story today on the BBC about an osprey hatching for the first time in Ireland for 200 years, which again felt like one of those stories that if it wasn't summer might not have made the 8 o'clock news. But it was a nice, well, it tied into this obviously, but also does just make you think about these stories of kind of survival and also like rebirth and all this attention that's being put onto conservation. So any more attention, I think, is only a good thing.
Yeah, and the good news aspect of that osprey's birth does kind of tie into one other thing that is being spoken about with the rise of birdwatching as a hobby, which is that it's meant to be good for mental well-being. Emma, is that the truth?
Certainly, anecdotally, it seems to be the case, especially in the aftermath of lockdown. To say that birdwatching is good for getting you out of the house may seem a little bit reductive, but I think that certainly is the case. That sort of like getting out into nature is good for mental health. And BBC's Springwatch presenter, wildlife presenter Chris Packham, has spoken very candidly about his mental health struggles and personal suicide attempt, and has spoken about how engaging with nature and that's helped him. And there are plenty of other examples of that being the case.
Yeah, it's hard to think how watching birds could be anything other than basically a positive. But my thanks to this week's flock, Harriet, Emma, and Julia. That's all we have time for this week. And like one of the main joys of twitching itself, you can follow this show entirely for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine, by the way, with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Arian McNichol. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week,